fired.
What happens after first responders leave?
The horrific events that actually happened.
And politicians.
We will not relent.
We do what we all know in our gut needs to be done.
Have offered their thoughts, prayers, and promises.
I ask the nation to pray for them.
I ask that you keep in your prayers.
No more thoughts and prayers. Thoughts and prayers fill coffins. Actions save lives. What are you doing today?
So many people still talking, but who is still listening to those who matter most?
People are removed from these school shootings and all that because it's not them. That's when it gets real.
We reached out to those most impacted by mass shootings in Texas.
Oh, the kids, they're getting the kids out.
Survivors, teachers, police officers, and families, asking what they still want answers to.
Very frustrating that it's still happening and no one's really doing anything about it.
They're asking. CBS 11 is listening, searching for answers. His outrage caught the attention of the world.
Mayday wore green high-top Converse with a heart she had hand-drawn on the right toe because they represented her love of nature. Camilla's got these shoes. Can you show these shoes, please?
One Uvalde native talking about another.
Wore these every day. Green Converse with a heart on the right toe.
Matthew McConaughey.
These are the same green Converse on her feet that turned out to be the only clear evidence that could identify her after the shooting. How about that?
Demanding change for a 10-year-old girl whose spirit lives through a drawing on her size 5 green Converse high tops.
Obviously, a lot of people know her for her shoes or green shoes. That's taken on a symbolism of its own.
Hello there, and thank you so much for taking the time to join us. I'm Doug Dunbar. As we begin searching for answers, we first return to what was lost May 24th of 2022. 19 students and 2 teachers died in their elementary school. Our Ken Molestina begins our journey in Uvalde, where grief, anger, and so many questions still remain.
Funny story is with those shoes.
Green was her favorite color, so when Maite found them on a sale rack,
that's how they landed on her feet.
And it didn't take her long to wear them in.
Why did you draw hard on your shoes? I just got those for you. And she goes, oh, she's like, just because. She's like, I really like them.
When you saw them in the White House and Matthew McConaughey was holding them, what were you thinking? What were you feeling at that time?
Wore these every day. Green Converse.
I was thinking of her. And I was telling her, look how far you've made it.
It's sad that I can't hear her voice.
A teddy bear in Jacqueline's room.
We have, they gave us a little bears with recordings, you know, and I go in there and press the button.
Keeps her voice alive. You hear her voice?
And just little things like that hurt, you know. I'm sorry.
2 of 19 students killed, along with their 2 teachers inside of Rom Elementary. One wanted to be a marine biologist, the other a veterinarian. Jacqueline had just celebrated her first communion.
Can you go back to that one, just real quick? That's the picture I saw online. What are you thinking when you see that photo and you see her dressed like that? So innocent.
Like I said, she looks like an angel, and that's the dress she wore to her grave.
That dress?
Mm-hmm.
The growing memorial behind me will one day soon go away, and in fact, so will the school. There are already plans to tear it down. But what could remain here in this town far longer than anyone wants are the lingering, unanswered questions that keep Uvalde up at night.
I wanted to finally push for support with these gun laws. Find answers. I want answers why this police department did what they did, or actually why they didn't do what they were supposed to do.
And the main question still, why did it take so many officers 77 minutes to breach the classroom door and take out the 18-year-old shooter?
No one knows what kids or anything else like that.
But supposedly the victims are here. I'm not 100%. There's a bunch of information flying around.
They had guns. They had vests. Our children and our teachers were left defenseless to fend for their own lives. And my daughter paid the ultimate price because of their inactions.
I just saw the ones that were outside, and when we heard those gunshots, they didn't rush in. You know, they just get back.
The flawed response has been called an abject and systemic failure. The video showed the world how much time went by, something these parents lived that day.
Of course, we were angry. We told the cops, "Go do your job, man. Go in there." That we can't because we had to hold you back. Like there's kids in there.
People in Texas, people all around the United States support, vote, fight for these children, because today it was mine, tomorrow it could be yours. These better trained PD officers, why? Why did they wait so long? Why did they go in and then pull back?
While both parents wait for the answer to come out, they too are making sure their children's legacies live on.
What would you want these folks to know about what you guys want them to do?
Make these changes. Make it a little bit harder for these people. Because if not, things like this are just going to keep happening over and over and over. And I know staying quiet and in the comfort of my home, just grieving my daughter, I'm not putting in my part, and I'm not doing her any justice by doing that.
Maite, the girl with the heart-drawn green shoes.
She was just an all-around sweet girl. My sweet girl. That's what I called her, my sweet girl.
And Jackie, who was enchanted by the Eiffel Tower in France, is how their parents want them remembered.
Full of love, you know, she was every typical 9-year-old kid, you know, happy, big-hearted.
Thank you, love you, bye.
And I can tell you, Doug, just from being down there and speaking to the folks, this is one of those events where Uvalde just really is never going to be the same ever again.
I've watched through your reports the raw emotion that continues to come from the community. I wonder, you know, do you foresee that getting any better for them at all?
I certainly hope that at some point they can. In the meantime, they need those questions answered, and that's the way they get there. They have to have these questions answered, and they want to be treated like they're important down there. We hear time and time again that they're being treated as second-class citizens, and they want that to stop too.
Ken, thank you so much. No one knows the pain felt in Uvalde perhaps more than the people of Santa Fe, Texas. 300 miles and 4 years now removed from that gunfire that forever changed that small Texas town. They've since prayed with politicians, they've heard their thoughts, believed their promises. But as investigative reporter Brian New shares, survivors in Santa Fe are still waiting for promises made to become promises kept.
Can you pinpoint when in your life you no longer felt like a kid?
It just all changed after that.
For Zach Mewey, it's easy.
I never got that kid back from that day, and I probably will never get him back.
Zach walked into his sophomore art class 4 years ago, worried about a late homework assignment. Seconds later, he ran out.
We have several shots fired.
Fearing for his life.
He's actively shooting. He's in the art room. We got shots fired right now, guys.
My classmates died. I had some friends die, and I barely got out with my life, you know.
8 students in Zach's art class, along with 2 teachers, died. The 17-year-old gunman eventually surrendered to police.
It changes you. It changes the way you think, and it changes the way you act. Like I said, I was in a really dark place for a long time, and, you know, it's probably because of that day.
Every time there's another school shooting, Zach spends hours thinking on how it could be prevented. And while he doesn't have an answer, Zach believes he knows the problem.
The mental health problem, I believe, is the root of it all.
Which is why Zach wants to know why the state of Texas hasn't done more to help teenagers with mental health.
Every time something like this happens, most people know that it's a mental health problem. It is just never talked about, and I don't know why.
We're going to be striving to find strategies that will prevent actions like this from ever happening again.
In the days after the Santa Fe High School shooting, Governor Greg Abbott did talk about mental health, and state officials did do something about it. Texas lawmakers approved nearly $100 million to create the Texas Child Mental Health Care Consortium, with the goal of providing access to mental health resources to all Texas students through a telehealth program called TChat. The way it works is teachers recommend troubled teens who are then screened by licensed school psychologists through live video conversations. It allows psychologists to reach more students in more schools.
Has it worked?
I think it has worked, yes.
Dr. David Lakey is the Chief Medical Officer for the University of Texas Systems. He heads the Mental Health Consortium. Dr. Lakey says he knows TChat is working because it's being used. Since the program started nearly 3 years ago, it's helped more than 12,000 Texas students.
The other reason that I think it's working is because we ask the parents, is it working? And when we do that kind of analysis, we get overwhelming feedback that the parents and the kids are satisfied and believe that they are significantly better or better because of that TChat service.
So if this program is working, why isn't it available for every Texas student?
That's where we need to go.
This school year, TChat will be providing telehealth services at 417 school districts across Texas, covering 59% of all Texas public school students. But that still leaves more than 800 districts not enrolled in TChat, including Uvalde CISD.
Uvalde was not one of the districts that had the TChat program. Had that school had the program, would things have turned out different?
So what I've told the state legislature, if 5 years ago we could have had this program there, and when he was in 7th grade or so, figured out that things weren't going well, and then linked him to the services that he needed, I think that's a situation where it would have been much less likely that this individual would have done what he did.
The challenge, Dr. Lakey says, is not funding. It's getting schools on board. Some are hesitant about a new program. The other challenge is finding enough mental health professionals to do the job.
One of the barriers that our institutions have is just hiring the people that we need in order to provide this service to all the schools across the state of Texas.
The lack of mental health resources in Texas schools goes far beyond the shortcomings of the TChat program. Nearly 600 school districts reported to the state not having a single school psychologist on staff. The National Association of School Psychologists recommends schools have at least one psychologist for every 700 students. For Texas to meet that minimum standard, they need to make 5,600 hires.
And I've told the legislature that exact point, that they can give me a bucket full of money, but if I can't hire the people to provide these services, I can't spend those dollars.
Texas has incentive programs to lure people into mental health professions, but it'll take years to see the payoff. Based on the recommendations from the National Association of School Psychologists, of the more than 1,200 school districts in Texas, we found just 39 districts have an adequate number of mental health professionals. Those districts serve less than 1% of all Texas students.
But while state officials say it's a workforce problem and some school districts say it's a money problem, there are some schools that have found a solution. Up here about 60 miles north of Dallas, Sanger ISD has prioritized mental health professionals in its budget to ensure it's had enough on staff to meet national recommendations. And then when money ran short for other programs, the school got creative.
Mental health is a priority for this community and for this school district. It's what's kept me here 20 years.
Ann Hughes is the district's director of student behavior intervention. She says to get around the lack of state funding, Sanger ISD partners with churches, charities, in the city to bridge gaps in student services. Ann has also applied and received grants to help with mental health funding. But it's what Sanger ISD has done with the money that sets it apart.
We have the indoor climbing wall. We're going to put a punching bag in here, a balance beam.
In 3 of Sanger ISD schools, there are movement rooms and chill rooms where students learn to manage their emotions. Inside Linda Tutt High School, where kids who struggle the most are sent, there's a free grocery store. The store not only meets a need for many of these students, but since it's also run by students, it gives them a sense of purpose and mimics a real-world job.
We teach behavior the way other individuals teach math. So we don't give up when somebody's having behavior problems. We get to the bottom of it.
For every program, Sanger ISD collects data so the district knows what's working and what's not. But you don't have to look at the numbers to find success. Just listen to the students.
Would you like the bread in your front seat, ma'am? I come here because it helps me feel better to help other people that need it.
Preston Westbrook graduated from Linda Tutt High School in May, but still volunteers every week at the school grocery store. It's his way of saying thank you.
All right, thank you for coming. Thank you. She understands what I went through. I've been up for 2 days with 3 hours of sleep. I couldn't sleep. She helped me through it.
So you're still working the same schedule?
Yeah, probably wouldn't be here right now without her, actually.
Preston is now 18, has a solid job, but it hasn't been easy. By the time Preston started high school, he says he had bounced between 26 different foster homes.
And about 12 of those all abused me. Mentally, physically, and the other way too.
Preston had a severe anger issue when he got to Linda Tutt High School, often running onto the roof of the school to escape.
It was about probably 50 feet up, 60 feet up. That's how I'd get away from people when I would get mad, because my anger, I mean, I've ripped doors off hinges when I was 9 and a half. I punched holes through metal doors. That's how I got my boxer fractures. I've had 7 of them. I've just... Without Ann, I wouldn't be here. I think there should be more schools like this, honestly.
This is my first time here, so...
Outside Santa Fe High School sits an empty chair, the unfillable chair. Listed are the names of those who were killed by a gunman who in February was ordered by a judge to remain at a state mental hospital.
We'll never get them back. All we can do is remember.
After surviving the shooting at his school, Zach felt students' concerns and his concerns about mental health were ignored.
I was just thinking that whole final 2 years, like, you know, where's my opinion at?
Now, 4 years later, the majority of Texas schools still offer little to no mental health resources.
Why is that when several years ago we said this was going to be a priority for the state?
So I think the state has made this a priority. And I think what they put in for the Texas Child Mental Health Care Consortium was a significant statement to how they prioritize these services. And again, it's a significant investment, but that's not enough. We need to continue to put more money in and build out additional programs if we really want to have the services throughout the state of Texas that our kids need.
While it may be too late for many of his friends that were victims and he's going through his own trauma, we can grab the future and stop talking and just do more. Just start pushing forward.
That was our Brian New. Mental health coverage was not the only promise made after Santa Fe. A promise of safer schools was made as well. But as CBS national investigative correspondent Stephen Stock discovered, promises don't always keep our kids safe.
They're having a shooting at the high school.
The pictures and the sound.
We have several shots fired.
Hard to watch and hear.
School shooting, an active shooting, several people down.
The horror and fear in schools both in Santa Fe and Uvalde.
He's shooting in the classroom. He got me, right?
Hard to imagine. But Flo Rice doesn't have to imagine. She lived it.
It was just, utter terror.
He's actively shooting. He's in the art room.
Right across the hall from that art room on May 18th, 2018.
And we got out in the hall and I heard the most deafening, horrific sound that I felt it reverberate through my body. I had never experienced anything like it.
More than 4 years later, the memories still fresh.
So I sit up and I realize I cannot move one of my legs. And then I look and realize that I had bloody bullet holes in my legs.
10 souls were lost that day, 8 young students and 2 teachers, 13 wounded, including Flo.
He was hunting them. He was mocking them, telling them to come out and answer their phones that their mommy was calling. And as he shot each one, he'd say another one bites the dust. It was just horrific. What I lived through was just nothing in comparison. But I had no idea.
Flo survived physically, but emotionally, the healing stopped the moment she heard about yet another school shooting in Texas.
Shots fired! Get inside!
This time at Robb Elementary in Uvalde. 19 students and 2 teachers massacred, 17 others wounded.
It was just a stab in the heart. I just literally felt pain in my heart because it's what we tried so hard to not let happen again.
For years after her horror, Flo and her husband Scott worked nonstop with Texas lawmakers to fix the system and pass new laws with the goal of making schools safer.
Do we really want our kids safe, or do we want business as usual?
Senate Bill 11 is the school safety bill. Shortly after the Santa Fe shooting, lawmakers in Austin passed several bills, including Senate Bill 11, meant to address school safety. But critics, including Flo and Scott Rice, say those laws have proven to be mostly ineffective. Top state officials admit they've had trouble enforcing the laws among independent school districts around the state. As Scott Rice put it,
words on paper.
30 ayes, 1 nay. The lawmakers provided millions of dollars to enhance school safety, requiring school districts to have emergency operating plans and to expand mental health initiatives.
SB 11 has no teeth. There's nothing in it that penalizes schools if they don't do it. You want to self-audit yourself, check the box, done. Do you have to do what's in there? No.
So under state law, you have to have security plans in place. You have to have security audits that are conducted.
In his first interview since the Uvalde shooting, Texas Education Agency Commissioner Mike Morath, the state's top educator, admitted that the new changes in state law were not always followed.
It's one thing to have a plan in paper. It's another thing entirely to have a plan that is practiced and executed. And I think we've seen even in the case of Uvalde, you have plans that were written that people were not consistently following.
Was TEA given enough power for those who didn't comply? There are some who say TEA is toothless here.
It has largely been structured as a self-policing system to date.
Even with the second school tragedy, Morath believes that the laws passed after Santa Fe made Texas schools safer.
The legislature's action, the governor's leadership after Santa Fe has absolutely made schools more safe all over the state of Texas. We know with certainty that other incidences have been prevented.
What would you tell the parents who say, you let me down because this wasn't supposed to happen again?
Yeah, it's an extremely difficult question to answer. As a dad, I remember the shooting in Santa Fe happened, and you cry and you have anger, but in my responsibility as Commissioner of Education, I have to be reflective on what is the policy and practice landscape that allowed this to happen, and what do we learn from this that we didn't know then that we can change.
Schools need to be held accountable.
Flo and Scott Rice are not convinced.
You know, we can build $40 million football stadiums. We can't spend $4 million on safety. You know, and if you don't survive Friday morning art class, you can't have Friday night lights.
Oh, it's going to happen again. And again, and again, and again. And people cannot comprehend it can happen to them. You just can't. You cannot conceive that because it's too horrific. But it can.
Thanks to our Stephen Stock. So what happened to Senate Bill 11? We asked the bill sponsor, Larry Taylor, to talk to us and to you. His office told us that he was unavailable for comment, but other lawmakers are talking. CBS 11 political reporter Jack Fink, in fact, knocked on a lot of doors to ask one question for you. Can Texas do anything to make schools safer?
That was one of the failures of what happened in Uvalde.
Governor Greg Abbott tells CBS 11 that laws passed after the deadly Santa Fe high school shooting in 2018 didn't go far enough in making sure school districts follow state safety and security standards.
We can see from what happened in Uvalde that in fact those laws either did not have teeth or they were not fully complied with.
The Texas School Safety Center spotted problems with compliance in 2020 after going through the emergency operation plans for more than 1,000 school districts. It found only 67 districts had plans that were sufficient, and 626 districts didn't have an active shooter policy as required. The results surprised State Representative Nicole Collier of Fort Worth.
That's very disappointing. That's a failure on the system.
During a hearing in June into the Uvalde massacre, the School Safety Center's director, Dr. Kathy Martinez-Prather, told a Texas Senate committee their organization did not go to the schools themselves to determine whether they complied with state law. At least one lawmaker asked why.
Not clear on our authority to be able to go and do compliance follow-up checks.
Records show the center said the same thing after the Santa Fe high school shooting 4 years ago. Martinez-Prather told a similar Senate committee, quote, "The center has no statutory authority over school districts to ensure this requirement is met." State Representative Tony Tinderholt of Arlington wants answers.
We need to have inspection teams go out and actually conduct the inspections. You're going to hear me repeat myself a lot over that. It's not being done right now to the level that it should be.
State Representative Matt Shaheen of Plano wants the state to take more control.
Clearly, I think we need to take a look at expanding the role of TEA, Texas Education Agency. Do we expand the role of the Texas Commission on Law Enforcement?
State Senator Royce West proposes the state grade school districts on their security policies.
That's why I'm advocating that we have an accountability system, that schools get accountability ratings, just like they do in academia.
We asked Democratic candidate for governor Beto O'Rourke how he would make sure school districts comply with safety and security standards.
We've got to hold superintendents, trustees, principals, everyone involved accountable to make sure that that safety is to the greatest degree possible guaranteed.
He also said further restrictions on gun sales are needed. Following Uvalde, Governor Abbott ordered TEA to require school districts to check all schools' exterior doors before classes start and each week after students return. And the Texas School Safety Center will be reviewing partial safety audits each district is required to submit. Governor Abbott says more requirements to ensure school safety are on the way.
We, Jack, expect to do two things. One is we expect to reach agreement on even more enhanced standards and ensure that there is going to be teeth to it so that there will be compliance. And I'll add to that, will ensure that there's going to be accountability at all levels through the process.
To ensure compliance, the governor created a new position in the TEA, Chief School Safety Officer.
Here's where we may need to go, and that is to impose greater accountability or consequences for schools that are not employing the best safety standards that can help the school.
Starting next month, the Texas School Safety Center is going to be conducting random intruder detection audits at school campuses, and this is going to mark the very first time that this agency is doing so on site across the state.
Talk to us about and give us an update on lawmakers. They've been looking into Uvalde. Recommendations are forthcoming. Any idea when?
Well, we've been checking into this, and the Texas Senate Committee tells me that they are looking to release their recommendations in September, and the House is looking at November or December.
All right, Jack Fink, we thank you, sir. Perhaps nothing is more Texas than a strong belief in the Second Amendment, which is why so many here support arming Good Samaritans. But will that always help? It's a question without an easy answer. It was the first service after Christmas 2019, halfway through communion prayer at West Freeway Church of Christ. A lone gunman stood up, spoke briefly to church deacon Tony Wallace, and then killed him. In less than 2 seconds, he then turned, shot, and killed parishioner and armed security team member Richard White. 2 terrifying seconds that Jack Wilson recounted to CBS 11 just days after the shooting.
After he shot Richard and Tony, he went and started towards the front of the sanctuary, and that's when I was able to engage him, and I fired 1 round.
A single shot fired from the back of the sanctuary. To this day, Wilson grieves the loss of his 2 friends, but he's also grateful to have likely saved so many other lives.
I'm curious your thoughts when you saw Buffalo and then just such a short time later, Uvalde. What's the first thing that Jack Wilson's thinking about when you see what unfolded?
Why was there not someone there that could help stop that in both cases?
It's a question many have asked, and the answer depends largely on the event itself. CBS 11 did some digging, and we found that very few mass shooting incidents have been resolved by bystanders who had a gun. Of the 464 active shooter events looked at over the course of 20 years, 242 ended before police could respond. But the active shooter was shot by someone else who was not law enforcement just 24 times. We also found that shootings involving Good Samaritans with guns have ended both good and bad. In Arvada, Colorado last year, armed Good Samaritan Johnny Hurley is caught on camera shooting a gunman who had just shot and killed a police officer moments earlier. But in the seconds after Hurley kills the bad guy, a responding officer mistakes Hurley for the shooter and killed him. In Superior, Nebraska, 2021, a fired employee came back with a gun. He shot 3 people, killing 2 of them. As it was happening, another employee managed to grab a gun in an office and return fire. He stopped that shooter, just like Jack Wilson did.
It is frustrating when some people still think, well, nothing can happen here. When you don't prepare for things, the tragic results are what fall out of that. I still want to know, with the shooter in Uvalde, an 18-year-old that's working 8 hours a week at Wendy's has the money to buy what he had in his possession, which is somewhere at least $5,000.
When the Uvalde shooter entered the school, he was armed with an M4 rifle and body armor. He also had an AR-15 style rifle, 20 boxes of ammo, and 17 30-round magazines. The investigation found that he had purchased all of that legally.
He had money and a joint account with his grandmother and used a debit card to make those online purchases, several online purchases, at least 6, prior up until the day of the attack, or actually to the day of his birthday, May 16th.
Jack Wilson will be the first to tell you that every situation is unique. There is no blanket solution. But having lived through and taken down an active shooter himself, being unarmed will never be an option for him.
People ask me, well, how did you deal with, killing somebody? I didn't kill a human being. I took out evil.
What's called the Gun Violence Archive defines mass shootings as 4 or more people shot or killed in just one incident. And Texas leads the nation by that definition. 228 people have died in Texas since 2018, and that's more than any other state. So why this state? Why us? We asked investigative correspondent Stephen Stock to find out.
It was belligerent. It was unpredictable. He pulled out the gun from underneath his coat, and it was terrifying.
January 15th could have been yet another mass shooting in North Texas.
He said agree.
A gunman terrorized 4 people at the Congregation Beth Israel Synagogue in Colleyville for 11 hours. Police say Malik Akram arrived in Texas weeks before the incident, stayed at a local homeless shelter, then bought this gun from a man he met on the street. Under Texas law, it was considered a private sale. No background check required.
Texas is one of those states where it's easy to get a gun.
Easy to get a gun since most Texans can carry a gun in public without a license. Arlington's police chief Al Jones says that makes it harder for him and his officers.
You don't have to have any training. You don't have to have anything. You can just have, 21 years old, and you can go get a gun.
And that's impacting other states. ATF data analyzed by CBS News shows between 2010 and 2020, more than 36,000 guns originally purchased in Texas turned up at crime scenes in other states. One example, the case of DeMontre Hackworth, charged with selling more than 90 guns from Texas and other states, including some that showed up in crime scenes in Maryland and Canada. Feds say he skirted background checks because his license to carry did not require him to go through repeated checks. Hackworth pleaded not guilty. His lawyer had no comment. 9 of Hackworth's guns showed up in Texas crime scenes, and those guns aren't the only ones. In 2020, firearms purchased in Texas later turned up at Texas crime scenes 27,000 times. That's 27,000 guns in 1 year.
It's not surprising. There's a lot of firearms in circulation in the state.
Dallas Police Chief Eddie Garcia says he's not worried about the law-abiding folks with guns, but about criminals who have easy access to firearms.
Who's being hurt by this? Our community is being hurt by this. Our victims are being hurt by this. Our men and women that are out there every day to take that criminal element off the street, they're being affected by this.
Chief Garcia believes addressing gun crime requires looking at all aspects of the criminal justice system.
There's nothing worse than having no law than having a law that's not enforced or people held accountable.
The justice system appeared to work here in the synagogue hostage case. Henry Williams, the man who sold that gun to Akram, pleaded guilty to being a felon in possession of a firearm. He faces up to 10 years in prison. And Doug, police eventually killed the gunman before anyone got hurt.
Our thanks again to Stephen Stock. When there is a mass shooting, the medical community always responds. That's happened twice at San Antonio's University Hospital. Our Robbie Owens spoke with a surgeon who worked to save lives after both Sutherland Springs and Uvalde.
I don't like saying it, have sadly cared for 2 of the largest mass shootings in modern U.S. history in the span of 5 years. And it's personal to me.
Dr. Ronald Stewart finds himself fighting another infectious disease with often fatal consequences.
Shots fired! Get inside!
Gun violence.
It is our number one epidemic that impacts our children and young people the most.
In cities, suburbs, and in small towns made famous by a mass shooting, like Uvalde.
To hear a 9-year-old child describe the horrific events that actually happened it makes me sick. It makes me sick.
Still, the doctor remains focused on the family's pain.
We have families who are coming to the hospitals looking for their loved ones, and they're not here. And the reason why they're not here is because they're dead. And to realize that is, it's heartbreaking.
The bandages on his heart must hold.
So you're thinking about what if?
What if always?
Because as a surgeon, he's already preparing for the next one, while learning from each previous tragedy.
We came out of Sutherland Springs with some action items,
such as more education and training on bleed control kits.
It's the CPR of the 21st century.
Courtney Edwards is a trauma nurse at Dallas's Parkland Hospital and leads their trauma community outreach. Over the years, the Parkland team has taught thousands of North Texans.
We provide this training to churches, schools, faith-based organizations, Boy Scout troops, Girl Scout troops, and office building. We go wherever.
How to stop the bleed.
Then I'm going to grab the windlass rod and we are going to twist and twist and twist until I can't twist anymore.
Edwards is passionate about prevention, as is Dr. Stewart.
Whenever I look back, and I've done a lot, okay? But whenever I look back, I feel like I could have done more.
Because there was another promise made post-Sutherland Springs.
To prevent these events from happening, and you can probably tell how I think we did. We failed. with respect to that.
In spite of those failures, Dr. Stewart is surprisingly positive about the outlook for change. His message to the community: gun violence is preventable. He points to a report from the American College of Surgeons, a committee composed almost entirely of surgeons who are also gun owners, were tasked with finding common ground. Among their recommendations, robust background checks for all firearms purchases and transfers, required firearm registration backed by an electronic database. Lawmakers could consider reclassifying high-capacity, magazine-fed, semi-automatic rifles under the National Firearms Act. The act already imposes additional restrictions on certain types of weapons, and federally funded research into firearm injury and prevention, to also include exploring the root causes of violence. Dr. Stewart believes building consensus is key to finding solutions, as he is far from finished.
Whenever I think about it, I could have done more. Could have done more, and should do more, and must do more.
Dr. Stewart has earned a right to be cynical, but Doug, I can't stop thinking about just how hopeful he is and how focused he is on solutions. He thinks those recommendations can work.
So he's got hope, he's got focus. What's the holdup on making the actual changes?
I think it's a matter of priorities. As a nation, the doctor sees a nation just so focused on the fight and pouring so much energy into demonizing those who disagree with us about guns that we haven't left enough room for conversation and the ability to find that common ground, just as those surgeons did.
We need to find it. Robbie, thank you so much. One refrain you hear after every mass shooting: it's a mental health issue or problem. But are mass shooters more predisposed to mental illness than others? Investigative reporter Brian New visits with a survivor who is searching for the answer to that very question.
It's been said before, the path to healing is neither straight nor short.
You don't forget what happened.
But Pastor Jeff Laster says he's living proof.
I can understand, what they're going through.
That healing is possible.
You don't forget, like I mentioned Sydney, I don't forget Sydney. But we'd be able to move on and move forward and heal from it and be able to use that to help others.
23 years ago, 500 teenagers gathered for a youth event at Wedgwood Baptist Church in Fort Worth. Jeff, the church's custodian at the time, was out in the foyer.
Literally, right where I'm standing.
When he went to greet a man who was walking into the church.
And just was reaching out to shake his hand. Before I had a chance to say anything, he just reached, had like a light kind of pull over, reached underneath it, grabbed 9mm, shot me twice.
The gunman shot more than a dozen others, killing 7, including Jeff's close friend and the children's choir director, Sidney Browning. The gunman then shot himself. The names and faces of those engraved in the memorial, Jeff will never forget. Over the years, he says he's also thought a lot about the gunman. He says every time there's another mass shooting, he finds himself asking the same questions.
What was his background? Was it family life? Did he have some mental health issues that pushed this? That's the kind of thing I've always wondered. There's always more to the story.
So we set out to try to answer Jeff's question. Who are these mass shooters? We reached out to researchers from across the country who have studied hundreds of mass shootings, and we took Jeff's question to them.
Anybody who shoots somebody else has a mental health challenge, period.
We often hear after a mass shooting that mental illness is to blame. But according to the Columbia University research study of 1,800 mass murders, only 8% of all mass shooters were diagnosed with a severe mental illness, such as schizophrenia or severe bipolar disorder.
Could it be that a lot of these just weren't diagnosed?
That's a good question. It's possible. It's possible that our sources for our data were limited.
Dr. Raggy Gurgis's research, however, did find a much larger percentage of mass shooters, 25%, suffered from less severe mental illnesses like depression and anxiety. But that closely mirrors the general population. So if mental illness is not the common denominator among mass shooters, what is?
I think the goal was to figure out who mass shooters are.
Our second stop was St. Paul, Minnesota, where Dr. Gillian Peterson and Dr. James Dinsley founded what's widely considered the largest research center on mass shootings. It's known as the Violence Project. Through years of research, they've identified 4 defining moments that most perpetrators experience on the way to a mass shooting. The path to violence often begins with early childhood trauma. At a young age, 42% of mass shooters experience physical abuse, sexual abuse, parental suicide, or were a victim of severe bullying. Researchers say if unaddressed later in life, this trauma can feed a perpetrator's rage. The second step on the pathway to violence is crisis, a loss of a job, a breakup, a feeling of hopelessness. In many cases, it's suicidal crisis. 72% of mass shooters were suicidal either before or at the time of the shooting. Those suicidal thoughts lead to the third step, the radicalization. The Violence Project found perpetrators time and again searched for guidance, going to the internet, reading manifestos of past gunmen, ending up in chat rooms where mass shooters are revered. Many of them then shared their own plans. 44% of mass shooters leak their plans, often posting about it on social media. And that leads to the final stage, access to a firearm. According to the National Institute of Justice, 77% of mass shooters got their guns through a legal purchase, often gaining access close to the time of the shooting.
We're not looking to say, here's the checklist of if you've done this, this, and this, you're going to be a school shooter. But it's looking at what are the warning signs, what are the commonalities, what do we see happening in these perpetrators' lives over and over and over again.
By knowing the pathway, Dr. Peterson and Dr. Dinsley say we now know where to intervene, adding that everyone has a role.
So if it's something like safe storage of a firearm in the home, if you've got a teenager in the home, or if it's something like reaching out with an act of kindness to somebody who you know is struggling, or if you see something, saying something and reporting that so that there is an intervention in place, we all can play that role. We can all mentor the young men in our lives to try and prevent this from ever happening again.
Obviously, we were devastated. We had 7 who were shot and 7 who were wounded.
Over the years, Jeff Laster, who is now a pastor at Wedgwood Church, has gotten to know the family of the gunman who shot him.
We actually ended up having a really good relationship with the guy who came into Wedgwood with his family. They had done everything they could do, and it wasn't their fault.
Jeff says understanding who the gunman was has allowed him to move forward with life, helping him to heal.
It's something that you just have to choose to kind of live with it and move forward, or continue to live in that moment. And I don't want what happened to me 23 years ago to, in a sense, dictate the rest of my life.
You know, you watch that, it's hard to even fathom there could be a relationship, but
Yeah.
there is.
There is. Pastor Laster said that the family of the gunman actually reached out to the church to apologize. And it was in those conversations with family members that he realized that there was another family that was grieving and going through their own trauma.
Right, it makes sense. At the end of the day, what do you think the takeaway is?
Research shows that it's getting to people early and intervening on that pathway before it reaches the end.
Brian New, thank you so much. In an ideal world, no shooter would ever get to pull the trigger. But what can we do to try to stop those contemplating that kind of violence before they act? It's what a former Dallas police officer who was in the command center that night that 5 Dallas officers were shot and killed thinks about. He spoke with our Robbie Owens.
A school, a grocery store, a movie theater, a church. A police-protected downtown Dallas march.
Shots fired. Yeah, when you hear that as an officer, it takes it to a whole nother world. And then you hear officer down.
Terrence Hopkins is a 31-year veteran of the Dallas Police Department and president of the Black Police Association. He was in the police command center when gunfire erupted on July 7, 2016.
It didn't seem real, but it was real.
Sniper fire rained down on a peaceful protest. injuring more than a dozen and murdering 5 officers. The shooter, an Army veteran with an arsenal of weapons and a mind warped by hate.
There's people out there getting fed that stuff right now, Robbie. Who needs to sell propagandized hate?
The market for hate flourishing online.
It's a fire hose.
DPD's Major Stephen Williams is the Intelligence Division commander.
These systems allow us to identify locations, times, dates, words, tones, phrases.
Social media threats are just part of what he oversees at one of 3 North Texas fusion centers. Established in the wake of the 9/11 terror attacks, the centers investigate threats and create a pathway for all levels of law enforcement, from local to federal, to communicate more effectively.
And then we vet the tip. If we need more follow-up, more information, they can communicate with us.
Much of the conversation now focused on the terror that's being groomed at home. He says the center saw an increase in activity following the Uvalde school shooting and shares an example.
There was some dialogue between a student that was very unsettling to a parent who observed it. The parent then submitted the tip to us, and then we were able to identify who the student was, and then partnerships with DISD detectives and DPD detectives were able to go out and speak to that parent and the child to figure out what's going on.
The major points out that not every incident proves to be a valid threat. Often, reports reveal a cry for help, and they respond to those with what's called ride care teams.
It's a police officer, a firefighter, and a clinician. So it's more of not a law enforcement approach. It's more of a clinician-driven, community-based response to addressing mental health issues.
Not sure if a concern is worth reporting?
I'd rather have the tip.
Major Williams doesn't hesitate. Better to report than regret.
Because that's my biggest concern, is that we see stuff all the time and we don't say something. And I'm asking for our community to say something.
We have to start looking at individuals that are in our circles who may start changing, their thought processes, their comments, because to me, a lot of this could be prevented in those early stages.
Our Robbie Owens. What is worth asking? Do programs like iWatch really have the ability to help stop a potential shooter before they act? Nicole Baker now looks to the town that was home to one of the nation's earliest and deadliest mass school shootings for some answers.
Teenagers today live life thinking about something many generations before them did not.
I mean, it's always so scary, and it's always like in the back of my mind.
She was an innocent little girl. A school shooting.
I mean, being in a lockdown myself, I've had to do it like countless of times as a student.
That's why Junior Ashley Petronovich, a Safe to Tell student ambassador, wants to make sure kids at her Colorado high school know they're never alone.
I think it's important to let people know about Safe to Tell because a lot of students might not have that trusted adult that they can go and talk to.
Colorado officials created the program, a statewide tip line that allows students and others to report anonymous concerns or threats, a first-of-its-kind program in response to Columbine.
That showed that people had information about that tragedy, different pieces of the puzzle, but didn't know where or how to report that information.
If you ask Stacy Jenkins, the director of the program, it does what it set out to do.
But what's unique about it and why it works is that there is attention given to every tip.
There are 3 ways to submit a tip: through the Safe to Tell website, app, or a phone call. Analysts who receive it then engage with the person making the report, asking more questions if needed, while the tipster still remains anonymous. Possible responses include a parent being notified, a conversation with a student, or a welfare check.
Then we compile that data and we complete an annual report that shares that information with the public.
And that data shows during the 2020-2021 school year, Safe to Tell received more than 11,000 reports. The majority of tips included suicide threats, welfare checks, drugs, self-harm, and cyberbullying. The program received 53 reports for a planned school attack.
Students don't have to understand every detail of the situation, but if they have a genuine concern and their motivation is to help someone, then they should make the report and let the experts process that information.
But the program isn't perfect. Safe to Tell receives false reports, an average of around 2%, often meaning someone made it to harm or bully another student. Jenkins says it's a small percentage compared to the more than 90% of reports that led to some kind of action.
I'm fearful if Safe to Tell didn't exist that there could have been other tragedies.
We wanted to know, does something like Safe to Tell exist here? And if so, does it work? The closest thing we could find, iWatch Texas. Launched in 2013, iWatch Texas is where the public can submit anonymous reports on terrorism or suspicious activity in their communities, all through a website, app, or by phone. In 2018, the program expanded to include school safety reporting after the Santa Fe high school shooting.
I can add vehicles. I can add witness info.
All iWatch tips filter through one of Texas's many fusion centers, like here at the Dallas location.
The Select Committee on Youth Health and Safety will come to order.
But a recent Texas House Committee meeting revealed just how little iWatch is used for school reporting. Remember that 11,000 number from Colorado? In 2021, in Texas, it's 300.
This is very low number.
So why are so few people reporting to iWatch? Through our investigation, we found many school districts don't know much about it. And these cities, each promotes the anonymous reporting system it uses. DPS officials say using a statewide reporting system as opposed to a school-specific one guarantees tips from all over Texas come together. After Uvalde, Governor Greg Abbott sent a letter to DPS and top education officials recommending they figure out how to best market iWatch to schools.
I have every confidence, if adopted, we would identify threats that occur.
And that's the big difference between iWatch and Colorado's Safe to Tell. It's well known. It is adopted, although it does have a nearly 2-decade lead on the Texas program.
I usually say as a starting point, make sure that you've got buy-in, that you have support from school districts, you have support from law enforcement, you have support from legislators, because it is a big lift and it's a village.
A village needed to save lives.
It isn't just about me, it's about my entire community, and I'm willing to just, send in this tip and get the support that we all need.
Our thanks to our Nicole Baker. A lot of irony for this reporter based on that story. April of 1999, I spent 7 straight days in Littleton, Colorado covering that Columbine massacre. I can tell you that I never dreamed then that we'd be sitting here nearly 24 years later discussing what we have for the last hour. It's been sobering for you, same thing for us and for everyone touched by gun violence. Our simple hope is that some of your questions have been answered. And while knowledge is power, the path to never having to hear about a mass shooting again, it's an uncertain one. But what is certain is that if we don't talk, if we don't share ideas, if we do nothing, history will be bound to repeat itself. Let's all find common ground to keep our kids safe. For all of us here at CBS 11 News and CBS News, I'm Doug Dunbar. Thank you for watching.